The gentle lapping of waves against the shoreline created a soothing rhythm that seemed to wash away the worries of the world. Clearwater Beach, with its pristine white sand and crystal-clear waters, stretched out before CLA Dawson like a slice of paradise. The retired police officer, her once dark hair now streaked with dignified strands of silver, settled into her well-worn beach chair with a contented sigh. CLA had chosen this particular spot, just a stone's throw from the iconic Pier 60, for its perfect balance of liveliness and tranquility. To her left, families were setting up colorful umbrellas and coolers filled with picnic lunches. To her right, a group of young surfers waxed their boards, eagerly eyeing the forming swells. The scene before her was a far cry from the high-stress environments she'd navigated during her years on the force, yet there was a part of her that missed the adrenaline rush of protecting and serving. As she took a long sip from her water bottle, savoring the coolness against the growing heat of the day, CLA found her gaze drawn to a young family near the water's edge. A little girl, no more than 5 or 6, giggled uncontrollably as she chased after a golden Labrador puppy. The dog, all gangly legs and floppy ears, bounded through the shallow water, kicking up sparkling droplets that caught the sunlight like tiny diamonds. "Here, Sonny," the girl called out, her voice carrying on the sea breeze. "Bring back the frisbee." CLA couldn't help but smile at the scene. It reminded her of her own childhood in Tampa, not far from where she sat now. She'd had a dog too, an old mutt named Rusty who'd been more family than pet. Those memories, tinged with both joy and nostalgia, brought a lump to her throat. Shaking off the wave of emotion, CLA reached into her beach bag and pulled out a worn paperback, a mystery novel she'd been meaning to finish for weeks. But even as she flipped to her bookmarked page, she found her attention continually drawn back to the beachgoers around her. Old habits died hard, and years of observing people had left her with a keen eye for detail and an inability to fully switch off. A couple of teenagers to her right caught her attention. They were huddled over a smartphone, speaking in hushed tones and casting furtive glances around them. CLA's cop instincts tingled, but she forced herself to relax. "Not your job anymore, Dawson," she reminded herself. Still, she kept one eye on the pair as she pretended to read her book. As the morning wore on, the beach grew more crowded. Tourists armed with oversized cameras snapped photos of pelicans diving for fish, while locals jogged along the water's edge, their feet leaving temporary imprints in the wet sand. The air filled with a cacophony of sounds, children's laughter, the calls of seagulls, and the distant strumming of a guitar from a beachside bar. CLA found herself people-watching more than reading, her mind creating backstories for the various characters that populated her slice of beach. There was the sunburned man frantically applying aloe vera to his lobster-red skin, clearly a tourist who'd underestimated the Florida sun. A few yards away, an elderly couple walked hand in hand, matching visors shading their faces as they collected seashells. Their easy companionship spoke of decades spent together, weathering life's storms side by side. As noon approached, CLA's stomach growled, reminding her that she'd skipped breakfast in her eagerness to claim her favorite spot on the beach. She considered walking up to one of the beachside cafes for lunch but decided against it. The day was too perfect to leave her little oasis. Instead, she pulled out a sandwich she'd packed, turkey on whole wheat with a smear of mustard, just the way she liked it. As she unwrapped her lunch, a shadow fell across her chair. Looking up, she found herself face to face with a young man selling ice-cold beverages from a cooler strapped to his back. "Water, soda, or beer?" he asked with a friendly smile. CLA was about to decline when she noticed the young man's t-shirt. It bore the logo of a local animal shelter she'd volunteered at a few times since retiring. Making a snap decision, she fished a few dollars from her wallet. "I'll take a water," she said, returning his smile. "Keep the change, it's for a good cause." The young man's face lit up. "Thanks. Every little bit helps. We've got a lot of animals needing homes right now." As he moved on to the next beachgoer, CLA felt a familiar tug at her heart. She'd always had a soft spot for animals, especially those in need. It was one of the reasons she'd chosen to volunteer at the shelter. There was something deeply satisfying about helping creatures who couldn't help themselves. Taking a bite of her sandwich, CLA let her mind wander. She thought about the various cases she'd worked on over the years, the triumphs and the heartbreaks. There had been times when the job had felt overwhelming, when the weight of human cruelty and indifference had threatened to crush her spirit. But there had also been moments of pure joy, like reuniting a lost child with their frantic parents or seeing a domestic violence survivor finally break free from their abuser. Retirement had been an adjustment, to say the least. After decades of living on high alert, always ready to spring into action at a moment's notice, the sudden quiet of her days had been almost deafening. She tried to fill the void with various hobbies, gardening, painting, even a brief stint in a community theatre group. But nothing quite scratched that itch, that deep-seated need to make a difference. As the afternoon wore on, CLA found herself dozing in her chair, lulled by the warmth of the sun and the rhythmic sound of the waves. Her book lay forgotten on her lap, pages fluttering gently in the breeze. It was a rare moment of complete relaxation for a woman who had spent most of her life on edge, always waiting for the next crisis to unfold. A sudden burst of excited barking jolted her awake. Blinking away the remnants of her nap, CLA focused on the source of the commotion. The little girl and her puppy were back, this time engaged in a game of tug-of-war with a piece of driftwood. The dog's tail wagged furiously as it playgrowled, clearly enjoying the game as much as its young owner. Watching them, CLA felt a pang of longing. She'd never had children of her own, her career had always come first, and before she knew it, that window of opportunity had closed. She didn't regret her choices, exactly, but sometimes she wondered what her life might have looked like if she'd taken a different path. As the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and pink, CLA decided it was time to pack up. She'd spent longer at the beach than she'd intended, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Days like this were what retirement was supposed to be about: leisurely, peaceful, free from the constant pressure of life or death decisions. She was just folding up her chair when she felt her phone vibrate in her bag. Fishing it out, she saw a text from her friend, Sarah. As she read the message, her heart began to race, and she felt a familiar surge of adrenaline course through her veins. CLA, need your help. Black lab named Shadow in trouble. Seen chained on a rooftop, looks bad. Address, 1234, Pine Street. Can you check it out? In an instant, CLA's relaxed demeanor vanished, replaced by the focused intensity that had served her so well during her years on the force. Without hesitation, she gathered her belongings and headed for her car, her mind already running through possible scenarios and strategies. As she navigated the busy streets leading away from the beach, CLA felt a mix of emotions. There was concern for the dog's well-being, of course, but also a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. It was as if a switch had been flipped, bringing her old self roaring back to life. Looks like retirement's over for the day, she thought, a grim smile playing on her lips as she pressed down on the accelerator. Little did she know, this call was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. CLA Dawson's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the busy streets of Clearwater. The peaceful beach day she had been enjoying seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a sense of urgency that pumped adrenaline through her veins. The message from her friend Sarah about a dog in distress had instantly reignited the spark of duty that had defined CLA's career in law enforcement. As she drove, her mind raced with possibilities. What kind of situation would she find? How bad was the dog's condition? And more importantly, what could she do to help? It had been years since she'd responded to an emergency call, but the familiar feeling of readiness settled over her like a well-worn jacket. The GPS on her phone directed her away from the touristy areas of Clearwater and into a part of town she hadn't visited in years. The streets became narrower, the houses more run down. Paint peeled from weathered siding, and chain-link fences surrounded overgrown yards. It was a stark contrast to the pristine beaches and upscale neighborhoods she'd grown accustomed to in her retirement. As she turned onto Pine Street, CLA's eyes scanned the house numbers, searching for 1234. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. A few kids played basketball in a driveway, the rhythmic bounce of the ball echoing down the street. An old man sat on his porch, watching her car pass with mild curiosity. Finally, she spotted the address. The house at 1234, Pine Street was a dilapidated two-story structure that had clearly seen better days. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and trash littered the cracked driveway. CLA's heart sank as she took in the scene. If this was how the outside of the house looked, she dreaded to think about the conditions inside, or on the roof where Shadow was reportedly chained. Parking her car across the street, CLA took a moment to center herself. She reached into her glove compartment and pulled out a small flashlight, a habit from her police days that she'd never quite shaken. She also grabbed a bottle of water, thinking the dog might be thirsty if it had been left out in the heat. As she stepped out of her car, the full force of the summer heat hit her. It was late afternoon now, but the sun still beat down mercilessly. CLA wiped a bead of sweat from her brow as she approached the house, her senses on high alert. The front yard was a minefield of discarded beer cans and fast food wrappers. A rusted-out car sat on cinder blocks, its windows long since smashed out. CLA picked her way carefully through the debris, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement or danger, old habits dying hard. When she reached the front porch, she paused. Should she knock? If there was someone home who was responsible for chaining a dog on the roof, they might not take kindly to her interference. On the other hand, if she could talk to the owner, maybe she could resolve the situation peacefully. Before she could make a decision, a faint whimper caught her attention. It was coming from above. CLA's head snapped up, her eyes searching the roofline. And there, barely visible from her angle, was a dark shape moving against the sky. Shadow. CLA called out softly. The shape moved again, and this time she heard a definite bark in response. Her decision made, CLA circled around to the side of the house. There, she found a rusty fire escape leading up to the roof. It didn't look particularly stable, but it was her only way up. Taking a deep breath, she began to climb. Each step on the metal staircase sent a small shower of rust flakes raining down. The railing creaked ominously under her grip, and more than once, CLA found herself holding her breath as she tested her weight on a particularly corroded step. As she neared the top, the whimpering grew louder. Shadow must have sensed her approach because she could hear the clicking of his nails on the rooftop as he moved about restlessly. "It's okay, boy," she called out softly. "I'm coming to help." Finally, she reached the roof. What she saw made her blood boil. Shadow, a beautiful black Labrador, was indeed chained to a rusted pipe that emerged from the roof. The chain was short, barely allowing the dog to move a few feet in any direction. There was no water bowl in sight, and the tar paper roof must have been scorching hot under the relentless sun. Shadow's reaction to her presence was heartbreaking. He cowered at first, clearly expecting some form of punishment. But as CLA approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones, his tail gave a tentative wag. "Hey there, Shadow," CLA said, crouching down to appear less threatening. "It's okay, buddy. I'm here to help." She held out her hand, letting Shadow sniff it. After a moment's hesitation, the dog licked her fingers, his tail wagging with more enthusiasm now. CLA's heart melted at the trust this abused animal was willing to place in her. Carefully, she examined the chain. It was secured with a padlock, which meant she couldn't simply undo it. She'd need bolt cutters or a key. Frustration welled up inside her. She was so close, yet still unable to free Shadow from his misery. "Don't worry, boy," she murmured, stroking Shadow's head gently. "I'm not leaving you here." She pulled out the water bottle she'd brought and poured some into her cupped hand. Shadow lapped it up eagerly, his tongue rough against her palm. CLA's eyes stung with unshed tears as she watched him drink. How long had he been up here without water? As she was considering her next move, a shout from below made her freeze. "Hey! What the hell are you doing up there?" CLA's heart raced as she peered over the edge of the roof. A man stood in the yard, his face contorted with anger as he glared up at her. This must be Earl Jenkins, Shadow's owner. "I'm checking on this dog," CLA called back, trying to keep her voice calm and authoritative. "He's in distress and needs help." "That's my dog, and it's none of your damn business," Earl shouted. "Get off my property before I call the cops." The irony of his threat wasn't lost on CLA. She'd spent years as a cop herself, and she knew exactly how this situation would play out if the police were called. But she also knew she couldn't back down now. Shadow needed her. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her years in law enforcement, I'm a retired police officer, and what you're doing here is animal abuse. This dog needs immediate medical attention." Earl's face darkened with rage. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England. That's my property, and you're trespassing." CLA's mind raced. She needed to buy some time, to figure out a way to get Shadow off this roof and to safety. An idea struck her. "Mr. Jenkins," she called down, "I understand this is your property. But right now, we have a situation that could end badly for both of us. Why don't you come up here, and we can discuss this civilly?" For a moment, she thought Earl might refuse. But then, muttering curses under his breath, he stomped towards the fire escape. CLA used the brief reprieve to pull out her phone and quickly text Sarah, at 12:34, Pine Street dog on roof. Need bolt cutters and animal control ASAP. She had just slipped the phone back into her pocket when Earl's head appeared at the edge of the roof. He hauled himself up, his face red with exertion and anger. CLA stood her ground, positioning herself between Earl and Shadow. "Now listen here," Earl began, jabbing a finger in CLA's direction. "I don't know who you think you are, but I told you," CLA interrupted, her voice level but firm. "I'm a retired police officer, and I'm here because this dog is being mistreated. Look at him, Mr. Jenkins. No water, no shade, chained up in this heat. This isn't right." Earl's eyes darted to Shadow, who had pressed himself against CLA's legs, trembling slightly. For just a moment, CLA thought she saw a flicker of shame cross Earl's face. But it was quickly replaced by defiance. "He's fine," Earl grumbled. "I was gonna bring him down later. He likes it up here." CLA's patience was wearing thin. "Mr. Jenkins, we both know that's not true. This dog is suffering, and if you don't do something about it right now, I'll have no choice but to report this to the authorities." The standoff continued, neither side willing to back down. The tension on the roof was palpable, broken only by Shadow's occasional whimper. CLA's mind raced, trying to find a way to resolve this situation peacefully while ensuring Shadow's safety. Just when it seemed they had reached an impasse, a new voice called up from the street. "CLA? You up there?" Relief flooded through CLA as she recognized Sarah's voice. Help had arrived. She looked at Earl, whose face had drained of color at the realization that more people were getting involved. "Mr. Jenkins," CLA said, her voice softer now, "I know you probably didn't mean for things to get this bad. But right now, you have a choice to make. We can work together to help Shadow, or this can get a lot more complicated. What's it going to be?" Earl looked from CLA to Shadow, then to the edge of the roof where Sarah's voice had come from. His shoulders sagged, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "Fine," he muttered. Just get him out of here." CLA nodded, relief washing over her. She turned to the edge of the roof. "Sarah, we need those bolt cutters up here." As Sarah made her way up the fire escape, bolt cutters in hand, CLA turned back to Shadow. The dog looked up at her, his brown eyes full of trust. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "You're going to be just fine now. I promise." And as she said those words, CLA felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about saving one dog. It was about rediscovering a part of herself she thought she'd left behind when she retired. The part that couldn't stand by while others suffered, the part that needed to make a difference. As Sarah reached the roof and handed over the bolt cutters, CLA knew with certainty that her quiet retirement was over. A new chapter was beginning, one that would combine her law enforcement experience with her love for animals. And it all started here, on this rundown rooftop, with a scared black lab named Shadow. With a satisfying snap, the bolt cutters sliced through Shadow's chain. The dog looked up at CLA, confusion and hope warring in his eyes. Gently, she unclipped the heavy collar from around his neck, revealing raw, chafed skin underneath. "You're free now, Shadow," CLA whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And I promise, I'm going to make sure you never have to go through anything like this again." As she gathered the trembling dog into her arms, CLA felt a sense of purpose flood through her. This was far from over. Shadow would need medical care, a safe place to recover, and eventually, a loving forever home. And Earl, well, Earl would have to answer for his actions. But for now, as she carefully made her way down the fire escape with Shadow securely in her arms, CLA focused on the immediate future. One step at a time, she told herself. First, get Shadow to safety. Then, figure out the rest. As her feet touched solid ground, she looked up at the fading light of the day. The peaceful beach seemed like a lifetime ago, but CLA wouldn't have traded this moment for anything. She was back in the game, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And with Shadow's warm weight in her arms, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard as CLA Dawson carefully made her way down the rickety fire escape, cradling Shadow in her arms. The black Labrador whimpered softly, his body trembling against hers. CLA whispered soothing words, her heart aching for the trauma this poor animal had endured. As her feet touched solid ground, CLA let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She glanced up at Sarah, who was following close behind, bolt cutters still in hand. The two women exchanged a look of shared determination. This was far from over. "We need to get him to a vet," Sarah said, reaching out to gently stroke Shadow's head. The dog flinched at first but then leaned into her touch, his tail giving a tentative wag. CLA nodded in agreement, but before she could respond, a gruff voice cut through the air. "Now hold on just a damn minute." Earl Jenkins stood a few feet away, his face flushed with a mix of anger and what CLA recognized as fear. He'd followed them down from the roof, and now he planted himself between CLA and her car, his stance aggressive. "You can't just take my dog," Earl snarled, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "That's theft, and I'll have you arrested." CLA felt a familiar calm settle over her, the kind that had served her well during tense situations in her years on the force. She gently passed Shadow to Sarah, murmuring, "Get him in the car." Then she turned to face Earl, her posture straight and authoritative. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her voice level but firm, "what we've witnessed here today is clear evidence of animal cruelty. Shadow needs immediate medical attention, and as a former law enforcement officer, I have a duty to report this situation to the proper authorities." Earl's face contorted with rage. "Former cop? That don't mean squat now, lady. You're just some nosy bitch sticking her nose where it don't belong." CLA didn't flinch at the insult. She'd heard far worse in her career. Instead, she took a step closer to Earl, her eyes never leaving his. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Jenkins. You have two choices right now. You can let us take Shadow to get the medical care he desperately needs, or I can call my former colleagues at the police department. They'll be very interested in what's been going on here, and I'm sure Animal Control will have plenty of questions for you as well." For a moment, the only sound was the distant barking of a neighborhood dog and the soft whine of Shadow from inside Sarah's car. Earl's eyes darted between CLA and the vehicle, indecision written across his face. CLA pressed her advantage. "Think about it, Earl. Do you really want to explain to the cops why you had a dog chained up on a roof with no water or shelter? In this heat?" Something in Earl seemed to deflate then, the fight draining out of him. His shoulders sagged, and he ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older and more worn. "I never meant for it to get like this," he muttered, not meeting CLA's eyes. "Shadow, he was my kid's dog, you know? But after the divorce, I just couldn't handle him. He was always barking, digging up the yard. I thought putting him up there would keep him out of trouble for a while." CLA felt a mixture of pity and frustration wash over her. How many times had she seen this in her career? People who got in over their heads, made bad decisions, and ended up causing harm without necessarily intending to. "I understand things have been tough, Earl," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But what you did to Shadow wasn't right. He's a living being, not a problem to be tucked away and forgotten." Earl nodded, a look of shame crossing his face. I know that now. I didn't know what else to do." CLA took a deep breath, considering her next words carefully. "Here's what's going to happen, Earl. We're taking Shadow to get checked out by a vet. I strongly suggest you voluntarily surrender him to Animal Control. They can make sure he gets the care he needs and eventually finds a home that can provide for him properly." Earl looked up sharply. "You mean, give him up for good?" CLA nodded. It's the best thing for Shadow. And it's a chance for you to make this right. For a long moment, Earl was silent, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he gave a small, defeated nod. All right, he said quietly. All right, take him. Just make sure he goes to a good home, okay? Relief flooded through CLA. She hadn't been sure how this confrontation would end, but this was the best possible outcome for Shadow. We'll make sure of it, Earl, she assured him. And thank you for making the right choice. As Earl trudged back towards his house, shoulders slumped, CLA turned to Sarah, who had been watching the exchange intently from beside the car. Let's get Shadow to the vet, CLA said, her voice thick with emotion. He's been through enough today. The drive to the nearest veterinary clinic was tense, filled with worried glances at Shadow, who lay curled up on Sarah's lap in the passenger seat. The poor dog's breathing was labored, and CLA could see angry red marks where the chain had dug into his neck. As they pulled into the parking lot of Clearwater Animal Hospital, CLA felt a surge of gratitude for her friend. Sarah had dropped everything to come to her aid, no questions asked. It was a reminder of the bonds she'd formed over the years, connections that remained strong even in retirement. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The veterinary staff whisked Shadow away for examination, leaving CLA and Sarah to wait anxiously in the sterile reception area. CLA found herself pacing, unable to sit still, her mind racing with thoughts of Shadow and concerns about what would happen next. It was past closing time when the vet, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Martinez, finally emerged from the back. Shadow is going to be okay, she announced, and CLA felt her knees go weak with relief. He's dehydrated and malnourished, and he's got some nasty abrasions from that chain, but with proper care, he should make a full recovery. CLA sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by emotion. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice choked. Thank you so much. Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. You did a wonderful thing today, bringing him in. Many people would have looked the other way. As the vet went on to explain Shadow's treatment plan, CLA found her mind wandering. She thought about Earl Jenkins, about the circumstances that had led to Shadow's mistreatment. She thought about all the other animals out there who might be suffering in silence, with no one to speak up for them. And then, like a bolt of lightning, an idea struck her. What if she could do more? What if she could use her skills, her experience in law enforcement, to help animals like Shadow? The thought took root, growing stronger with each passing moment. By the time Dr. Martinez finished speaking, CLA had made up her mind. This wasn't going to be a one-time rescue. This was going to be the start of something bigger. Sarah, she said, turning to her friend as they left the clinic, Shadow safely settled in for overnight observation. I think I need your help with something. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Let me guess. This isn't just about Shadow anymore, is it? CLA shook her head, feeling more energized than she had in years. No, it's not. I think I've found my new calling. But I can't do it alone. As they stood in the parking lot, the stars just beginning to peek out in the darkening sky, CLA outlined her vision. An organization dedicated to investigating animal cruelty cases, one that could work alongside law enforcement and animal control to bring abusers to justice and rescue animals in need. Sarah listened intently, her eyes growing wider with excitement as CLA spoke. When she finished, Sarah grabbed her in a fierce hug. Count me in, she said firmly. Whatever you need, I'm there. As they parted ways that evening, CLA felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since retiring from the force. She knew the road ahead would be challenging. There would be bureaucratic hurdles to overcome, funding to secure, and undoubtedly more heart-wrenching cases like Shadow's to face. But as she drove home, the events of the day replaying in her mind, CLA felt ready for the challenge. She had spent her career protecting and serving her community. Now, she would extend that protection to the voiceless, to the animals who couldn't defend themselves. Tomorrow, she would start making calls, reaching out to old contacts, and laying the groundwork for her new mission. But tonight, as she pulled into her driveway, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. One rescue might not change the world, but it had certainly changed Shadow's world. And for CLA, it had reignited a spark she thought had long since faded. As she stepped out of her car, she looked up at the night sky, a sense of peace settling over her. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself, a smile spreading across her face. Just the beginning. With renewed energy and a heart full of purpose, CLA walked into her house, already mentally preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. The quiet retirement she had once envisioned was now a distant memory, replaced by a new chapter filled with hope, determination, and the promise of making a real difference in the lives of animals like Shadow. As she settled in for the night, CLA found herself looking forward to the morning with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the chance to build something truly meaningful. And she was ready for it all, thanks to a serendipitous day at Clearwater Beach and a black Labrador named Shadow who had needed her help. The journey ahead would be tough, but CLA Dawson was no stranger to tough journeys. With her experience, her compassion, and her newfound purpose, she was ready to face whatever came her way. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thoughts were of Shadow, safe at the vet's office, and of all the other animals out there who needed someone to be their voice, their protector, their champion. And in that moment, CLA knew without a doubt that she had found her true calling. Retirement could wait. She had work to do. The early morning sun filtered through the blinds of CLA Dawson's modest Clearwater home, casting thin strips of light across her kitchen table. She sat there, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, her mind already racing with plans and possibilities. It had been less than 24 hours since she'd rescued Shadow from that dilapidated rooftop, but in that short time, her world had shifted on its axis. CLA took a sip of her coffee, savoring the rich aroma. She'd always been an early riser, a habit ingrained from years on the force, but today, she'd woken with a renewed energy that she hadn't felt in years. Retirement, she realized, had dulled her edges, softened the sharp focus that had defined her career. But now, that focus was back, razor-sharp and pointed towards a new mission. Her phone buzzed, screen lighting up with a text from Sarah. "On my way to the vet. Want to meet there?" CLA smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude for her friend's unwavering support. She quickly tapped out a reply, "Absolutely. See you in 20. As she got ready to leave, CLA caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at her looked different somehow. There was a light in her eyes that had been missing for too long. She straightened her shoulders, ran a hand through her silver-streaked hair, and nodded at her reflection. It was time to get to work. The drive to Clearwater Animal Hospital was quiet, the streets still sleepy in the early morning hours. CLA's mind, however, was anything but quiet. Ideas and plans tumbled over each other, each one sparking a dozen more. By the time she pulled into the parking lot, she had the bare bones of a plan forming. Sarah was already there, leaning against her car and nursing a large cup of takeout coffee. She looked up as CLA approached, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Morning, hero," Sarah said, her tone light but her eyes serious. "Ready to see our boy?" CLA nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. "More than ready. Did Dr. Martinez say how he's doing?" "She said he had a good night," Sarah replied as they walked towards the clinic entrance. "Ate a little, drank some water. It's a good start." The animal hospital was just starting to come to life as they entered. A young receptionist greeted them with a smile, recognizing them from the night before. "Dr. Martinez is expecting you," she said, gesturing towards the back. "Go on through." As they made their way down the sterile hallway, CLA's nose wrinkled at the sharp scent of disinfectant. It reminded her of countless visits to hospitals during her time on the force. Never pleasant memories, but necessary ones. This time, though, there was hope mixed with the antiseptic smell. Dr. Martinez met them outside one of the recovery rooms, her face tired but her smile genuine. "Good morning, ladies," she said. "I think someone's eager to see you." As the vet pushed open the door, CLA's breath caught in her throat. There, curled up on a soft blanket, was Shadow. The black lab's head lifted at their entrance, his tail giving a tentative thump against the blanket. "Hey there, buddy," CLA said softly, approaching the kennel slowly. She knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with Shadow. "Remember me?" For a moment, Shadow just looked at her, his brown eyes wary. Then, slowly, his tail started to wag more enthusiastically. He inched forward, stretching his neck to sniff at CLA's outstretched hand. "That's it," CLA murmured encouragingly. "You're safe now, Shadow. No one's going to hurt you again." As if understanding her words, Shadow let out a soft whine and pressed his head against the kennel door. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, unlocking it. "Go ahead," she said to CLA. "He seems to trust you." With gentle movements, CLA opened the kennel door and reached in to stroke Shadow's head. The dog leaned into her touch, his whole body seeming to relax. It was a small gesture, but to CLA, it felt monumental. This dog, who had every reason to fear humans, was choosing to trust her. "He's doing remarkably well, considering what he's been through," Dr. Martinez said, her voice low as she watched the interaction. "The wounds on his neck are healing nicely, and he's starting to put on some weight. Physically, he'll make a full recovery." "And emotionally?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Dr. Martinez sighed. "That's harder to predict. He's been through a trauma, and it will take time for him to fully trust again. But," she added, nodding towards CLA and Shadow, "he seems to have found a good start." As they discussed Shadow's treatment plan and next steps, CLA found herself only half listening. Her focus was on Shadow, on the way he leaned against her, seeking comfort and reassurance. In that moment, she felt the last pieces of her new purpose clicking into place. "I want to foster him," she said suddenly, cutting into the conversation between Sarah and Dr. Martinez. Both women turned to look at her, surprise evident on their faces. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked. "I mean, it's a big commitment, CLA. And with this new project you're planning?" CLA nodded, her resolve strengthening with each passing second. "I'm sure. Shadow needs a safe place to recover, somewhere he can learn to trust again. And I need this too. He reminded me of what's important, of the difference I can make. Having him with me, helping him heal, it'll be a constant reminder of why I'm doing this." Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Shadow could use a steady, patient hand to guide him. And from what I've seen, you two have already formed a bond." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of paperwork, instructions, and preparations. By early afternoon, CLA found herself standing in a pet supply store, cart loaded with everything a dog could need: a plush bed, food and water bowls, a variety of toys, and a soft, padded collar to replace the harsh chain that had left such angry marks on Shadow's neck. As she pushed the cart down the aisles, Sarah at her side offering suggestions and support, CLA felt a sense of excitement building. It had been years since she'd had a dog, not since her old partner Rusty had passed away early in her police career. She'd forgotten how much joy could be found in simple things like picking out dog toys or debating the merits of different types of kibble. "You know," Sarah said as they loaded the purchases into CLA's car, "I haven't seen you this fired up in a long time." "It's good to see." CLA paused, a bag of dog food hefted in her arms. "You're right," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I feel alive. Like I've finally woken up from a long nap." Sarah laughed, reaching out to squeeze CLA's shoulder. "Well, get ready for a lot less napping. Between Shadow and this new mission of yours, I have a feeling you're going to be busier than ever." As they drove back to the animal hospital to pick up Shadow, CLA's mind wandered to the challenges ahead. There would be a lot to do: establishing their organization, building relationships with local law enforcement and animal control, finding funding. But for the first time in years, the prospect of hard work didn't feel daunting. Instead, it felt invigorating. When they arrived at the clinic, Shadow was waiting for them, sitting patiently by Dr. Martinez's side. The change in him was already noticeable. His posture was more relaxed, his eyes brighter. When he saw CLA, his tail began to wag, thumping against the linoleum floor. "Look at you," CLA said warmly, kneeling down to greet him. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Shadow's response was to press his head against her hand, his whole body wiggling with excitement. CLA laughed, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This, she realized, was what had been missing from her life. This connection, this sense of being needed and of making a real difference. As they settled Shadow into the back seat of her car, a soft blanket cushioning him against the movement, CLA felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was just the beginning, she knew. There would be challenges ahead, moments of frustration and doubt. But looking at Shadow, seeing the trust in his eyes, she knew it would all be worth it. "All right, Shadow," she said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror as they pulled out of the parking lot. "Let's go home. We've got a lot of work to do, you and I." The drive home was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. CLA's mind was already racing with plans. She'd need to contact her old colleagues in law enforcement, reach out to animal welfare organizations, start putting together a team. But for now, she allowed herself to simply enjoy the moment. As they turned onto her street, CLA felt a surge of emotion. Her house, which had often felt too quiet and empty since her retirement, would now be filled with the sounds of paws on hardwood, the jingle of a collar, the soft snores of a sleeping dog. It would be a home again, not just a place to live. Pulling into her driveway, CLA turned to look at Shadow. The black lab was sitting up now, his eyes bright with curiosity as he took in his new surroundings. "Welcome home, Shadow," CLA said softly. "This is the start of something new for both of us." As she helped Shadow out of the car, his paws touching the grass of her front yard for the first time, CLA felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. This was where she was meant to be, what she was meant to do. Rescuing Shadow hadn't just saved his life, it had given her own life new meaning, new purpose. With Shadow by her side, tail wagging tentatively as he explored his new home, CLA walked towards her front door. She paused for a moment on the threshold, looking down at her new companion. Shadow looked back up at her, trust and hope shining in his eyes. "Ready for a new adventure, boy?" CLA asked, her hand resting gently on Shadow's head. Shadow's response was a soft woof and a wagging tail. And as they stepped into the house together, CLA knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more animals to save, more lives to change. But for now, she had Shadow, and Shadow had her. And together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The door closed behind them, shutting out the world for a moment. But tomorrow, CLA knew, they would face that world together. And they would make a difference, one rescue at a time. The weeks following Shadow's rescue passed in a whirlwind of activity for CLA Dawson. Her once quiet retirement had transformed into a bustling new chapter of life, filled with the challenges and joys of fostering a recovering dog and the excitement of launching a new mission. Each morning began early, with Shadow's gentle whines rousing CLA from sleep. She'd pad downstairs, the black lab following close at her heels, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. Their routine was simple but comforting, a quick walk around the block, breakfast for both of them, and then settling in for a day of work and recovery. CLA marveled at Shadow's progress. The angry red marks on his neck were fading, replaced by new fur growth. His ribs, once painfully visible, were now covered by a healthy layer of muscle and fat. But it was the changes in his behavior that truly warmed CLA's heart. In those first few days, Shadow had been wary and skittish, flinching at sudden movements and cowering at loud noises. Now, he greeted each day with a wagging tail and an eager bark. He'd taken to following CLA from room to room, as if afraid she might disappear if he let her out of his sight. At night, he curled up on his bed next to CLA's, his soft snores a soothing lullaby. "You're doing great, buddy," CLA murmured one morning, scratching behind Shadow's ears as they sat on the back porch. The dog leaned into her touch, his brown eyes full of trust and affection. It was moments like these that reinforced CLA's determination to see justice done, not just for Shadow, but for all animals suffering from abuse and neglect. While Shadow's days were filled with rest and gentle play, CLA's were a flurry of phone calls, emails, and meetings. She'd reached out to her old contacts in law enforcement, explaining her vision for an organization that would bridge the gap between animal control and the police force. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with many of her former colleagues expressing enthusiasm for the project. "It's about time someone tackled this," her old partner, Mike, had said during one of their long phone conversations. "You know how many times we had to turn a blind eye because we didn't have the resources or jurisdiction to deal with animal cases? This could be a game changer, CLA." Sarah had thrown herself into the project with equal fervor. She'd taken charge of the administrative side, researching the legal requirements for setting up a non-profit, drafting mission statements, and reaching out to potential donors. Her dining room table had become command central, covered in stacks of papers and laptop screens constantly open to spreadsheets and legal documents. "We need a name," Sarah said one afternoon, looking up from her work as CLA walked in with a fresh pot of coffee. Shadow trotted in behind her, immediately flopping down at Sarah's feet with a contented sigh. "Something that really captures what we're about." CLA poured them each a cup of coffee, her brow furrowed in thought. "How about Guardians of the Voiceless?" she suggested after a moment. Sarah's face lit up. "That's perfect. It emphasizes our protective role and highlights that we're speaking up for those who can't speak for themselves." As they hashed out the details, Shadow watched them with curious eyes, his tail thumping against the floor whenever one of them looked his way. CLA couldn't help but smile. In many ways, Shadow had become the mascot of their fledgling organization, a living reminder of why their work was so important. But even as CLA threw herself into building Guardians of the Voiceless, she never lost sight of the immediate goal, bringing Earl Jenkins to justice. The memory of Shadow chained on that sweltering rooftop still made her blood boil, and she was determined to see the case through to the end. Working with the local prosecutor's office, CLA meticulously prepared the evidence against Earl. She'd taken extensive photos of Shadow's condition immediately after the rescue, and Dr. Martinez had provided detailed medical reports documenting the extent of his injuries and malnourishment. "It's a strong case," ADA Jennifer Reyes assured CLA during one of their meetings. "With your testimony and the physical evidence, we should be able to secure a conviction for animal cruelty." CLA nodded, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sadness. She took no joy in seeing Earl punished, but she knew it was necessary, both for justice and as a deterrent to others who might consider mistreating animals. "What kind of sentence are we looking at?" CLA asked, absently stroking Shadow's head. The dog had taken to accompanying her to these meetings, seeming to understand the importance of the discussions. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Given the severity of the case and Earl's lack of prior offenses, we're probably looking at a fine and probation, possibly some community service. And, of course, he'll be prohibited from owning animals for a specified period." It wasn't as harsh as part of CLA wished for, but she understood the complexities of the legal system. This case would set a precedent, showing that animal cruelty would be taken seriously and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. As the weeks passed and the trial date approached, CLA found herself spending more and more time preparing. She reviewed her statement endlessly, determined to present a clear and compelling account of Shadow's rescue. Sarah often found her in the early hours of the morning, poring over legal documents at the kitchen table, Shadow faithfully at her feet. "You need to rest," Sarah would say, gently but firmly steering CLA away from her work. "You can't help Shadow or any other animals if you burn yourself out." CLA knew her friend was right, but it was hard to step back. The work had become more than just a mission, it was a calling, a purpose that filled the void left by her retirement from the police force. One evening, about a week before the trial was set to begin, CLA sat on her back porch, watching the sun set over the Gulf of Mexico. Shadow lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. As she absently stroked his fur, CLA found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. She thought about that day on Clearwater Beach, how close she'd come to missing Sarah's text. She thought about the fear and anger she'd felt seeing Shadow chained on that rooftop, and the overwhelming relief when they'd finally freed him. She thought about the long nights of worry during his initial recovery, and the joy of watching him slowly come out of his shell. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" CLA murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. The dog looked up at her, his brown eyes full of love and trust. He no longer resembled the frightened, abused animal she'd rescued. Now, he was healthy, happy, and full of life. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, CLA felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever the outcome of the trial, whatever challenges lay ahead for Guardians of the Voiceless, she knew she was on the right path. With Shadow by her side and a clear purpose in her heart, she was ready to face whatever came next. The sound of her phone ringing broke the peaceful moment. CLA reached for it, recognizing Sarah's number on the screen. "Hey, Sarah," she answered, her voice warm. "What's up?" "CLA," Sarah's voice was filled with excitement. "You're not going to believe this. I just got off the phone with Channel 7 News. They want to do a feature story on Shadow's rescue and our new organization." CLA felt a surge of adrenaline. This was exactly the kind of exposure they needed to get Guardians of the Voiceless off the ground. "That's fantastic," she exclaimed. "When do they want to do it?" "They're hoping to film this weekend," Sarah replied. "They want to interview you, get some footage of Shadow, maybe even talk to Dr. Martinez about his recovery. This could be huge for us, CLA. It's a chance to reach so many people, to really get our message out there." As Sarah continued to share the details, CLA's mind was already racing with possibilities. This news feature could help them reach potential donors, volunteers, and most importantly, it could raise awareness about animal cruelty and the need for stronger enforcement. "Okay," CLA said, her voice filled with determination. "Let's do this. We'll need to prepare, make sure we have our messaging clear. And we should check with Jennifer, make sure this won't interfere with the upcoming trial." "Already on it," Sarah assured her. "I'll start putting together some talking points. We'll want to focus on Shadow's story, but also emphasize the bigger picture, why Guardians of the Voiceless is necessary." As they continued to plan, Shadow stirred, sensing the change in CLA's energy. He sat up, looking at her with curious eyes, his tail wagging slightly. "Looks like you're going to be a TV star, buddy," CLA told him with a smile, ruffling his fur. Shadow responded with an enthusiastic bark, as if understanding the excitement in her voice. After hanging up with Sarah, CLA sat back, taking a deep breath. The upcoming trial, the launch of Guardians of the Voiceless, and now this news feature, it was a lot to handle. But as she looked at Shadow, seeing how far he'd come and thinking of all the other animals out there who needed help, she felt a renewed surge of energy. "We can do this," she told Shadow, her voice firm with conviction. "We're going to make a difference, you and me." Shadow responded by placing his paw on her knee, his eyes never leaving her face. In that moment, CLA felt a profound sense of connection, to Shadow, to her mission, to the path that lay ahead. Whatever challenges they might face, they would face them together. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to twinkle, CLA and Shadow headed back inside. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new challenges, but also new opportunities. The journey ahead was daunting, but with Shadow by her side and the support of friends like Sarah, CLA felt ready for anything. She paused at the door, looking back at the peaceful evening sky. The quiet retirement she had once envisioned seemed like a distant memory now. In its place was a life full of purpose, excitement, and the satisfaction of making a real difference in the world. And as she closed the door behind them, CLA couldn't help but smile. This, she knew, was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning of the trial dawned bright and clear, a perfect Florida day that seemed at odds with the gravity of what lay ahead. CLA Dawson stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her blazer and taking deep, calming breaths. She'd testified in court countless times during her career as a police officer, but this felt different. This was personal. Shadow padded into the room, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. He sat beside CLA, looking up at her with those soulful brown eyes that never failed to melt her heart. CLA knelt down, scratching behind his ears. "Today's the day, buddy," she murmured. "We're going to make sure what happened to you never happens to another animal." As if understanding the importance of the moment, Shadow leaned forward and gently licked her cheek. CLA chuckled, giving him one last pat before standing up. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The drive to the courthouse was quiet, CLA's mind racing with last-minute preparations. Sarah had offered to come along for moral support, but CLA had declined. This was something she needed to do alone, or rather, with Shadow by her side. The black lab sat in the back seat, his head tilted as he watched the familiar streets of Clearwater pass by. The courthouse steps were already bustling with activity when they arrived. CLA spotted Jennifer Reyes, the ADA handling the case, waiting for them near the entrance. The young lawyer's face broke into a smile as she saw CLA and Shadow approach. "Ready for this?" Jennifer asked, her voice confident but her eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. This case was as important to her as it was to CLA, a chance to set a precedent for how animal cruelty cases would be handled in the future. CLA nodded, her jaw set with determination. "More than ready. Let's do this." As they entered the courthouse, CLA felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her. This was her element, the pursuit of justice, the protection of the vulnerable. She'd spent her entire career doing just that, and today was no different. The courtroom was smaller than CLA had expected, already half-filled with spectators. She recognized a few faces: Dr. Martinez from the animal hospital, some of her former colleagues from the police force, and even a couple of reporters she'd spoken to for the news feature on Guardians of the Voiceless. And then, at the defense table, she saw Earl Jenkins. The man looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched and his eyes downcast. For a moment, CLA felt a pang of something almost like pity. Earl had made terrible choices, but she knew from experience that people rarely set out to be cruel. Often, it was a combination of circumstances, poor decisions, and a lack of support that led to these situations. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harriet Simmons entered, her stern gaze sweeping the room. "In the matter of the state versus Earl Jenkins, are both sides ready to proceed?" What followed was a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Jennifer presented the state's case with precision and passion, laying out the evidence of Shadow's mistreatment in stark, undeniable terms. Photographs of Shadow's condition immediately after his rescue were displayed on a large screen, eliciting gasps from some of the spectators. When it was CLA's turn to testify, she took a deep breath and stepped up to the witness stand. As she was sworn in, she caught sight of Shadow, sitting quietly next to Sarah in the gallery. The dog's presence gave her strength, reminding her of why she was here. CLA's testimony was clear and unwavering. She recounted the day of Shadow's rescue in vivid detail: the sweltering heat, the pitiful condition she'd found him in, the immediate need for medical attention. She spoke of his slow recovery, the physical and emotional scars that were still healing. "Your Honor," CLA concluded, her voice steady and filled with conviction, "what happened to Shadow wasn't just neglect. It was a deliberate act of cruelty, one that caused immense suffering to an innocent animal. But more than that, it's a symptom of a larger problem: the need for stronger enforcement and harsher penalties for animal abuse." As she stepped down from the witness stand, CLA felt a sense of relief wash over her. She'd said her piece, spoken for Shadow and for all the other animals who couldn't speak for themselves. Now, it was up to the judge. The defense presented their case, arguing that Earl had been overwhelmed and hadn't intended to cause harm. But their arguments seemed weak in the face of the compelling evidence and testimony presented by the prosecution. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Simmons cleared her throat. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on the stern-faced woman behind the bench. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her voice firm, "the evidence presented here today paints a disturbing picture of animal cruelty and neglect. While I understand that you may have been facing personal difficulties, that does not excuse the suffering you inflicted on this animal." Earl's shoulders slumped further as the judge continued. "I find you guilty of animal cruelty. You are hereby sentenced to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service to be served at a local animal shelter, and you are prohibited from owning or caring for any animals for a period of 5 years. Additionally, you will pay a fine of $5,000, which will be donated to animal welfare organizations." The judge's gavel came down with a resounding crack, and just like that, it was over. CLA felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and a touch of sadness for the circumstances that had led to this moment. As the courtroom began to clear, Jennifer approached CLA, her face beaming. "We did it," she said, squeezing CLA's arm. "This is a big win, not just for Shadow, but for all animals in similar situations." CLA nodded, still processing the outcome. "It's a start," she agreed. "But we've got a long way to go." As they exited the courthouse, CLA was surprised to see a small crowd gathered on the steps. Several people held signs supporting animal rights, and there were even a few news cameras. Sarah stood at the edge of the group, Shadow by her side, both of them waiting expectantly. One of the reporters spotted CLA and hurried over, microphone in hand. "Ms. Dawson, can you give us your reaction to the verdict?" CLA hesitated for a moment, then decided to seize the opportunity. This was a chance to spread awareness, to further the mission of Guardians of the Voiceless. Today's verdict is a victory, not just for Shadow, but for all animals who suffer abuse and neglect, she began, her voice strong and clear. It sends a message that our community will not tolerate cruelty to animals. But it's also a call to action. We need stronger laws, better enforcement, and more resources dedicated to protecting the voiceless members of our society. As she continued to speak, outlining the goals of Guardians of the Voiceless and the importance of community involvement in animal welfare, CLA felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she'd started this journey, to make a real, tangible difference. The impromptu press conference lasted for several minutes, with CLA fielding questions about the case, about Shadow's recovery, and about the work of Guardians of the Voiceless. By the time it was over, she felt drained but exhilarated. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah approached, Shadow trotting happily beside her. "You were amazing," Sarah said, pulling CLA into a hug. "I think you just recruited about a dozen new volunteers for Guardians of the Voiceless." CLA laughed, the tension of the day finally starting to ease. She knelt down to greet Shadow, who responded with an enthusiastic face-licking. "What do you think, boy?" she asked, ruffling his fur. "Ready to go home?" But as she stood up, CLA noticed a couple standing nearby, watching them with interest. The woman, a petite blonde with kind eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. "Excuse me, Ms. Dawson," she said. "I'm Emily, and this is my husband, Mike. We've been following Shadow's story, and, well, we were wondering if he might still be in need of a permanent home." CLA felt her heart skip a beat. She'd known this day would come. Shadow deserved a forever home, a family who could give him all the love and attention he deserved. But the thought of saying goodbye to him was more painful than she'd anticipated. "Shadow's been doing great," CLA said, her voice catching slightly. "He's come so far from when we first rescued him. He's loving, playful, and incredibly resilient." Emily nodded eagerly. "We've been looking to adopt a dog for a while now, and when we heard Shadow's story, it just touched our hearts. We have a big yard, and Mike works from home, so someone would always be there for him." As Emily spoke, Mike knelt down, holding out his hand to Shadow. The dog sniffed it cautiously, then gave it a gentle lick, his tail starting to wag. CLA watched the interaction, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Would you like to come meet him properly?" CLA found herself saying. "Maybe come by the house, spend some time with him?" Emily's face lit up. "We'd love that. Thank you so much." As they exchanged contact information and made plans for Emily and Mike to visit, CLA felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Sarah, a knowing look in her eyes. "You're doing the right thing," Sarah said softly. "Shadow deserves a family who can give him their full attention. And you have a bigger mission now." CLA nodded, blinking back tears. "I know. It's just, he's been such a big part of this journey. And he always will be," Sarah assured her. "He's the reason Guardians of the Voiceless exists. His story will continue to inspire and motivate our work." Over the next week, Emily and Mike visited several times. CLA watched with a mixture of joy and sadness as Shadow bonded with them, his tail wagging furiously whenever they arrived. It was clear that this kind, loving couple could offer Shadow the stable, happy home he deserved. On the day of the adoption, CLA found herself lingering over every moment. She took Shadow for one last walk around the neighborhood, laughing as he chased squirrels and sniffed every tree. When Emily and Mike arrived, their car loaded with new toys and a plush dog bed, CLA felt her heart constrict. "You be a good boy, okay?" she murmured to Shadow, kneeling down to look him in the eyes. "These are your new people now. They're going to love you so much." Shadow whined softly, sensing the emotion in her voice. He leaned forward, resting his head on her shoulder in what felt like a hug. CLA wrapped her arms around him, allowing herself one moment of grief. As she watched Emily and Mike drive away, Shadow's head poking out the back window, CLA felt Sarah's arm slip around her shoulders. "You know," Sarah said, "I was thinking. Maybe it's time we looked into getting an office space for Guardians of the Voiceless. Somewhere we could maybe have a small shelter attached, for emergency cases." CLA turned to her friend, a slow smile spreading across her face despite the tears in her eyes. "You know what? I think that's a great idea." As they walked back into the house, CLA's mind was already buzzing with plans. There would be more animals to save, more battles to fight, more lives to change. Shadow's journey had been just the beginning. And somewhere out there, she knew, there was another dog, another cat, another animal in need waiting for someone to be their voice, their protector, their champion. Thanks to Shadow, thanks to this incredible journey, CLA was ready to answer that call. The house felt emptier without Shadow, but CLA's heart was full. Full of memories, full of purpose, and full of hope for the future. As she settled at her desk, reaching for her phone to start making calls about potential office spaces, CLA felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was her new life, her new mission. And she was ready for whatever came next.